On behalf of Asia Society, Hong Kong, welcome. This is a program that this is kind of our last business and policy program to close out the year. We've had a very, very busy year. We had a wonderful board meeting last week where we reported to our board. Asia Society Hong Kong is doing very well, thanks to all of your support. Our chairman and our board member were very happy with some of the stuff that we had to report. And really the quality of the program, Asia Society here is really bar none. And it's something that I'm particularly proud of, and the staff who've worked on the programs, I want to thank them. And the business and policy program really is the genesis of Asia Society Hong Kong, although now we do about 75% of our program, about 70% of our program in arts and culture. The arts and the business and policy program, like tonight's program, really is what we are known for, and we continue to kind of break grounds with the kind of speakers we have. And tonight's speaker is one of our own here in Hong Kong, and I'm delighted to have Professor Shirley Lin here to talk about a subject that is really it's in the news a lot lately, isn't it? And when the book first came out, I believe in the summer, and Professor Lin approached us, and we were very interested in doing the program then, but because of timing issues and so on, we thought it'd be better to move it. And I know you were traveling. I've seen on Facebook, and I've seen a lot of coverage. The book has been getting a lot of great write-up and reviews and so on. So in some ways, I'm kind of glad timing has worked to our favor. I would not have known in June. I think we've done a lot of programs this last couple of months on the U.S. political situation, and you guys know what's happening in the U.S., so I don't have to repeat that. But what we did not know was how really all of a sudden Taiwan now is front page news, and I don't know how long it's going to be like that. I'm leaving for the U.S., leaving for D.C. Next week, and last time I was in D.C., I drove by the Trump Hotel, right, the old post office, and I took photos, like many people, thinking that, that's how he's going to end up on Pennsylvania Avenue. And so how wrong we all are. So this time I will pay due respect when I drive by Pennsylvania Avenue over the holidays. But the topic, it is really something of great interest to, I know, all of you. We have a lot of students here, as well as scholars. Harry, thank you for being here, and a lot of our friends who are very interested in this topic. And I'm really delighted that we can present this program at this time, and really thank Professor Lin for agreeing to do the program, the book program with us. Unfortunately, the book sold out. So you guys who missed out, we sold the book and it's all gone. But I'm sure she's happy to sign, those who bought a copy, sign a copy for you. And she is somebody who really has a very interesting career. She is a founding faculty of master program in global political economy in Chinese University. And she also has a wonderful, distinguished career in Goldman Sachs in the private sector, and invested in many of these direct investment in Asia, including in technology startups, such as a little-known company called Alibaba. And she has really, she is somebody, I think she's originally from Taiwan, and has, who better than Professor Lin from Chinese University to tell us about her book, Taiwan's China Dilemma. And I'm sure I'm really delighted to be kind of moderating the Q&A after the presentation. And so students and others, get your questions ready. And I know I'm going to have a few for Professor Lin. So Professor Lin, stage is yours.
Thank you for those generous comments, Alice. And thank you for years of support and friendship. And I don't say this lightly, because this book took too many years. And as everything in life is, it's all about timing. As I was publishing the book, my publisher decided to retire. And so it was delayed by a year, just when the Sunflower Movement began, and it became a perfect chapter to end the book with, as opposed to the previous version. Then as I finished the book, I started to do a speaking tour in the US, and with Trump's recent remarks, I have been not been able to sleep too much. And in fact, just a few hours ago, New York Times just posted an interview with me about my book and about other questions related to current events. So without further ado, I want to thank the students who are here, and many of my previous students, alumni, and esteemed members of boards I sit on, and many friends who've been watching me doing this book. And I think it's the greatest pleasure of this book was actually it allowed me to reach out to people I had been in touch with in the past in a different way, or with people that I had never met before, like civil society leaders and student movement leaders. But today I'm going to talk about actually cross-strait dilemmas as opposed to the name of my book, Taiwan's China Dilemma, because I think there's a dilemma now that needs more attention on all three sides, Taipei, Washington, and Beijing. Oops. So as a start, actually, New York Times asked me, are you, after the interview was done, are you a native of Taiwan? I thought that's such an interesting question. Is it not obvious? But yes, I am a native of Taiwan, and I never thought I needed to explain it. But the dilemma, of course, is as I was active primarily while I was in finance in mainland China, what I thought was remarkably interesting was something unexplained in my mind. And that was from the beginning of interdependence between Taiwan and China, I would say informally, even before the 1990s. But formally, the Taiwanese government began to regulate trade and investment in 1990. And you can see that China's GDP has grown from a little bit over twice that of Taiwan to now basically nearly 20 times, and Taiwan is merely the size of Guangdong in GDP. Now, this chart is important to frame the puzzle, which is why has Taiwan's economic policy toward China oscillated from extreme restriction sometimes to extreme liberalization as China has been growing steadily and dramatically. And as Taiwan's trade with China also grows. So in 1990, you could see there was barely any official records. However, by 2000, here it ends at 14, you could see that two-way trade actually by 2016 is around 150 billion. Now, the bars show you light and brown parts. The light part is import, the dark part is export. What is important in this chart is not noted, is that China would like to give economic benefits to Taiwan, of course, with a political intent. But if you look at this chart from 2006 to 2 more years down, 2016, actually, the 10-year, the trade surplus Taiwan enjoys with China has dropped to a 10-year low at $27 billion. At an all-time high, it was exceeded $40 billion. So trade has been more and more dependent on China, but the benefits have been inconsistent. And trade between Taiwan and China is very much dependent on foreign direct investment, which is different than other forms of trade where you can exit very quickly. Foreign direct investment is like a semiconductor plant or even a startup where you have to invest in people and in real estate. And most of Taiwan's trade, at least initially, was dependent on Taishang's investment, Taiwanese businesses going to China to make investments and therefore import parts perhaps from Taiwan and then export assembled goods. You can see here the light area is what Taiwan invests outward to the world, foreign direct investment. The dark area is what China is as a percentage of that. And you can see that it is more than 2/3. Last year it's dropped a bit, but overall the cumulative is 2/3 and it's very significant, also at around $150 billion. Now, what is the puzzle and the answer to it? Well, the puzzle I thought was very simple. Taiwan's policy towards China must be oscillating because there's too much trade, too much dependence, and there are surely many losers of this phenomenon of globalization. But through about 3 years of research, I did not find the data to support what I was thinking. And I had to go beyond history and sociology to finally find the answer. And that was parallel to the discussion about what Taiwan should do with China in trade and investment. It was beginning to talk about a taboo subject for the last 5 decades, which is who are we as a people? This is called self-identification, and this is something that Hong Kong people now understand it better and better, whereas Americans understand it very well, because when you apply for school or a job, you have to self-identify, whether you're Hispanic, whether you're Asian American, or you don't have to say who you are. That's called the non-respondent. And this also has a big category of non-respondent when Taiwan initially democratized. So after Taiwan democratized in 1987-88, Zhang Jingguo passed away, martial law was lifted, the taboo subject of who we are as a people began lifted, and Taiwanese history began taught for the first time, or at least discussed among Taiwanese. And you can see here the most reliable data by National Zhenji University, the Election Study Center, shows you when they ask people, are you Taiwanese, are you Chinese, are you both? Initially, you could see it's a quarter, quarter, and half. So a quarter thought they were Chinese, a quarter thought they were Taiwanese, and half of them said we're both, or actually many in the early days were afraid to answer and said, no, I'm not going to respond. As of 2016, let's just fast forward to 2 years beyond my book. This chart is from my book. But as of today, this year, basically the percentage of people who say they are Taiwanese has now been the majority since 2009 and has never dropped for the last 7 years. More importantly, as of 2016, the percentage of that line at the bottom, which is those who say they are only Chinese and nothing but Chinese, is now only at 3%. This is important because this is what Beijing cares about. For all the economic benefits that it has doled out, it wants to increase that lower number to be an uptick. More striking is in 1989, 52%, before this poll began officially. In a United Daily poll, then the leading newspaper, 52% of Taiwanese said they were only Chinese and nothing but Chinese. I just want to frame this in terms of the world, whether you go to Eastern Europe or you go to the Middle East. For a nation to change its identity from one to another completely, dramatically, in 30 years is very rare. The second way to measure Taiwanese identity is called future national status. This is a more nuanced way, although still quite crude in this poll, of asking people what they think, who they think they are. And that is, who do you want to be governed? What kind of political future do you want to see the island? And there are many choices. There are 7 choices here. You can say you prefer autonomy, or you want to decide at a later date, or you want to maintain the status quo, move towards unification, maintain status quo, move towards independence, and so on. Broadly speaking, there's 2 groups. The top line is what I call support for autonomy. Basically, we do not want to be ruled under the Beijing regime. The bottom line are those who support unification now or later. Now, the bottom line, as you can see, went from 20% to 10%. Again, this is Beijing's focus. But this is also not the most important figure. The most important figure is those who say they want to see immediate unification. That number, as of 2016 June, is 1.5%. So what has gone wrong? What is Taiwanese identity? Most people understand identity is a socially constructed concept. We're not told who we are, we simply feel who we are, and we also see others that define us. Now, in Taiwan's case, it actually needed to be articulated. After democratization 30 years ago, Taiwanese identity was initially ethnically based. And most people in Hong Kong would understand, particularly this audience, ethnicity doesn't mean blood in Taiwan's case, because 98% of Taiwanese are Han Chinese, including myself. Although I was told, for sure, I will have Aboriginal blood, because 82% of Taiwanese reportedly have Aboriginal blood. There's a high level of intermarriage because in the early days, under the Qing dynasty and Ming dynasty, the renegades went to Taiwan if they didn't have property, didn't go to school, were running away from the law. And generally, that's the kind of ancestors I have. But knowingly, when you get to Taiwan, the only way to acquire land is to intermarry with tribal members. And so there was a high level of intermarriage also because most Chinese men who went to Taiwan didn't bring wives, Taiwan was a frontier. Now, when Chiang Kai-shek government came in 1949, they artificially segregated the population into Benshenren and Waishenren for a variety of reasons. Initially, there was a clash between the two groups, and suddenly it was very clear there are those who came to Taiwan before 1949, otherwise known as from this province, Benshenren. And if you were from 1949 or later, even if you spoke Hokkien or Fujianese, you were called Waishenren. And this was put on your ID card, which we can appreciate in Hong Kong, is a very important part of everyone's life. And therefore, when you take examinations for school, for high positions in office, this is very well noted. Even if you're born in Taiwan, let's say in 1965, but your parents are from Shanghai, you will have an ID card that notes that you are Shanghainese. However, as economic integration with China deepened, this sense of Benshenren versus Waishenren which was very important right after democratization, and politicians talked about it all the time, because identity politics, as is known, is where you say, I am Taiwanese, I am Benshenren, so you should vote for me, regardless of what I think, or regardless of my policy. Or I'm Waishenren, so I will support your vision of a future one China, and that's what differentiated candidates. However, as economic integration with China deepened, identity consolidated, and increasingly Taiwanese identity embody a way of life. And this way of life is something that was taught to me by my interviewees. Over hundreds of interviews, I try to understand the linkage between identity and policy, and that's the focus of my research. However, most people don't think about it that way. It takes hours and hours of interviews and drinks and relaxation for people to say, well, it doesn't really matter what you think about jobs or equality. What is most important is if you are Taiwanese and you support an autonomous Taiwan, you should restrict trade and investment with China. And hence, I had to ask the question, what does it mean to be Taiwanese? And this is something that as the interview took years, over time, people also modified the way they thought about it. But increasingly, most people think about being Taiwanese as just embodying a way of life. And this way of life is something that CEOs of TSMC, of UMC, to student leaders of Sunflower Movement, they all would agree with. Way of life, which means you embrace values, civic values, like democracy, rule of law, freedom, basically. Whereas the ethnic definition of where your parents from or where you're from is less and less important. This is particularly important because today 1 out of 3 babies in Taiwan are born to foreign-born mothers from Southeast Asia or from China. There's a declining fertility rate in Taiwan, and therefore immigration is a very important source of population growth. And this way of life, of thinking in an inclusive way, allows Taiwanese to really become a more immigrant-friendly society that includes everybody in the debate about policy. Taiwanese identity among the younger generation, with open polls that are not very popular in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, also values international recognition. Taiwan is not a state in any organization. As a non-state community, it seeks to gain international recognition, but you could see it much more among young people. I was in Milan last year, passing through with my sister, who's also here, and Harry, and we went to see the World Fair. Taiwan, as many of you visited in Shanghai, had a pavilion in Shanghai. But in Milan, Beijing decided to actively exclude Taiwan, so Taiwan was not able to have a pavilion. Young students raised money through crowdfunding and took all of their money and put it into the pot and rented a space next to the Duomo and actually put up a pavilion that showed Taiwanese catering culture, bantou, which is basically the way Taiwanese have weddings and funerals and everything else. And this is something that young people value more and more. When I was speaking at Yale, I was booed by the audience who says, Republic of Taiwan. So there's this group of Taiwanese graduate students lurking in the background, and they picked up their passport and showed me. They changed the cover, which is actually illegal. They have a second cover to cover their passport and say, we just have to change the name to Republic of Taiwan. All will be fine. Well, international recognition matters a lot more to younger people than older people. And the second part is they care a lot more about clean air, clean food, non-poisonous food, and basically a sustainable environment, even if it means the trade-off is less growth. They also believe in economic freedom. They want to work anywhere they like. and open markets. But of course, under the premise of Taiwan first, it has to be good for Taiwan. And this was also taboo under the authoritarian Kuomintang rule. But the policy we see Taiwan has towards China oscillated. It oscillated dramatically. In 1995, you may remember, former President Lee Teng-hui went to Cornell University to make a speech. And in 95, 96, Beijing decided that this touched the red line. And they lobbed missiles around the waters of Taiwan. Lee Teng-hui, therefore, was able to push through an extreme policy to restrict investments in China when there was already a lot of investment. But basically, large investments and strategic investments were not able to go to China anymore. And a certain percentage of net asset value as an upper limit was imposed. So you couldn't invest too much in China as a public company or as a private company. He pushed through it with the National Development Conference, and there was a high level of support and consensus. And even his best friend, Y.C. Wang, then the richest man in Taiwan, broke off with him and never talked to him again until he died. Lee Teng-hui is still well and alive, having the last word. In 2001, very interestingly, President Chen Shui-bian, the first Democratic Progressive Party leader to be elected president of Taiwan, reversed the policy. So this is counterintuitive. KMT wanted more restriction and the DPP wanted more liberalization. He proposed active opening in conjunction with with the head of the Mainland Affairs Council, who is the president today, Tsai Ing-wen. She was the chief WTO negotiator for Taiwan, and working under Chen Shui-bian, they proposed active opening to relax no haste and allow companies, for example, TSMC and UMC, these semiconductor companies, to invest in China. Because DPP had very few friends in business, and they were very desperate to have a closer relationship and more support. However, this generated so much opposition that 500,000 people went on the street, from elementary school teachers to engineering association. They were very afraid of the consequences of moving a key and strategic industry into China. They said it will hollow out Taiwan. And again, in 96 and 2001, basically, if you supported one China and a reunification of Taiwan and China, you should support liberalization, one would say. And if you were really Taiwanese and you cared about Taiwan, you would restrict trade and investment with China at all cost. But over time, in 2006, you see that the debate changed. Through parsing through newspapers and magazines, the discussion of identity was no longer conflated with the discussion on economic policy. In 2006, the same President Chen Shui-bian, who was under great personal scandal, was trying to appeal to the base and therefore proposed restricting investment again. And this was also met with resistance. Most companies did not comply, and so he was not able to restrict very much except to tighten the monitoring or the enforcement of existing regulation. By 2006, the Kuomintang returned a president, Ma Ying-jeou, for 8 years, and he proposed very China-friendly economic policy, starting with the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, which started negotiation in 2008 and concluded in 2010, June 1, signed in Chongqing. It was very wide-scaled and renamed to call ECFA, which means Akoha, means prosper again, to be rich again. This was met with wide-scale protest again. However, at the time of signing, 72% of Taiwanese supported the ECFA. So what has happened between 1996 and 2008? Well, there was a great change in the nature of the discussion. And this is the framework that I concluded with, that without a sense of national identity, it is impossible to identify and prioritize what is important to the community. Once Taiwanese decided they were Taiwanese, they no longer have to think about whether a policy was good for China or good for Taiwan. Initially, if you thought you were Chinese, then economic liberalization, of course, would be beneficial to China, therefore to Taiwan, because Taiwan is part of China. But if you thought you were Taiwanese, that discussion would have to be changed. And so this definition of national identity basically overshadowed the discussion on economic policy and other areas. However, as national identity consolidated after 2006, where more than half the people said they were either Taiwanese or both Taiwanese and Chinese, and after 2009, more than half said they were only Taiwanese. The result of that is one can no longer differentiate one's policy based on identity compared to other political leaders or advocates. And prioritizing national interest then becomes much more focused on rational considerations and economic logic. At this time, also, Taiwan's civil society became very vibrant. The formation of opinion clusters and debate over policy options became intense. That is because, of course, even without a discussion on national identity, the discussion would still be very intense because there is a big trade-off among all of these interests, whether we want more growth, more sustainability, more equity. Taiwan was a very equitable society, hence it's often called the first Chinese democracy as well as an economic miracle because it grew for decades in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s while becoming more equitable. But this was changing after liberalization with China. And the formation of these clusters and debate over all policy options leads to cross-strait economic policy. The top and bottom, of course, are environmental factors that I don't deny are very important for a small nation like Taiwan. You can see that in the 4 episodes, each episode had grounded an identity debate. The first episode, there were more Chinese than Taiwanese, and there was a missile crisis, which made everybody very anxious and nervous. So you have a high level of support for no haste. And then there were slightly more Taiwanese than Chinese, but still about a quarter in the second episode. And then you will remember the internet bubble burst in 2000 when I was very much involved in that sector. And Taiwanese primarily export hardware technology. So this led to a dramatic drop in export, and Taiwanese became much more focused on growth, stability, and economic security as a result, leading to some support for active opening. And then in 2005, Beijing instituted the anti-secession law to stop Taiwanese from leaning toward independence. Otherwise, Beijing would be required to use force. And this led to a discussion of a much longer list of interest, from equity to security. And then in 2008 and 2010, if you remember, with the subprime crisis, the global financial crisis, everybody in the world was focused on equity and growth and stability and security. But at this time, Taiwanese were primarily Taiwanese, and so this was no longer taking up all of the discussion on economic policy. In conclusion, when identity is contested, there's an emotional debate over extreme economic policies, and they seem very appealing. For example, in the earlier episodes. As identity consolidates, extreme policy options may be eliminated, and the nature of the debate becomes much more rational. But a consensus is still very difficult to reach because the controversial nature of trade-offs, as I mentioned, among different interests that different generations may hold dear. And most importantly, identity can become salient again, even after it's consolidated, because the threat from China to that identity may increase as it has in the last 3 years under Xi Jinping's government, and you come to the largest student protest in Taiwanese history. Just a note, does anyone know why it's called the Sunflower Movement? I was told this in one of my stops. The sunflower actually is something that grows in southern Spain, where I lived for a year, and it is not native to Taiwan. But they figure out how to plant it in southern Taiwan, and now it's all over southern Taiwan. It is a sign of globalization. The students here are saying we are against certain aspects of globalization. They took over the legislative house, the parliament, for 21 days, and they forced the government to, they obstructed the ratification of the cross-Strait service trade agreement, which was already signed between Ma Ying-jeou and Beijing, but was not ratified. And it continues not to be ratified 2 years later today. So in summary, what is Taiwan's China dilemma? Well, should Taiwan increase its economic competitiveness by deepening integration with China, becoming more prosperous and therefore actually stronger? Or should it avoid overdependence in order to be more secure? I want to turn briefly to two other aspects, Beijing and Washington. Beijing has actually a bigger dilemma than Taiwan or Washington, because Beijing is the party that seeks unification and therefore needs to do a lot more to move it to the next step and change the status quo. As Taiwanese national identity, of course, consolidates, fewer and fewer Taiwanese want unification, even under the most favorable conditions. So Beijing has three very sub-ideal options. First is to stay the course, keep doling out economic benefits, and hoping that this will restore Taiwanese identity to a Chinese identity. Here you have the Kuwon Conference in 1993, when I was working actually at Goldman Sachs in Singapore. Every evening after work, I went to volunteer to check out what was going on. And I never imagined that in 2016, I would be writing this book and it would still be unresolved. Here is 2008, the Jiang Cheng talk. Jiang Bingkun now starting negotiation with his counterpart in China. And this led to the 2010 Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement being signed. Last year, this is the Shima meeting or the Ma-Shi meeting, depending on which side you're on. And it led to actually a landslide victory for the opposition party, the Democratic Progressive Party. So it wasn't too much to speak of. Increase the pressure is also something Beijing has done. Use economic and diplomatic sanctions, aim missiles, more and more missiles at Taiwan. This is CCTV. Every day at noon, you could watch it. During the week of Taiwanese presidential election, they showed a simulation of PLA attacking the presidential palace. In fact, then the netizens, the Wu troops, basically attacked a young K-pop singer in Seoul who was fired by her agent for waving a Taiwanese flag after the competition. This reportedly led a lot of young people to vote for Tsai Ing-wen as opposed to Eric Chu. And the International Civil Aviation Organization is only one additional example of, after Tsai Ing-wen assumed presidency, Beijing has basically marginalized Taiwan at every possible opportunity, including ICAO, which is a triennial meeting which Taiwan attended 3 years ago. Only a few days before the meeting this year in Montreal, they were told, Taiwanese were told they were not able to attend. And not only that, reportedly several reporters were unable to actually go in to do any reporting. But these, of course, this option has only backlashed. And so Beijing uses this strategy, the hardest strategy, if you will, sparingly so far. Finally, I think the most effective strategy is to narrow the gap, undertake reforms to reduce the differences, allow elections. This is a village election, and here is the civil society that is now more and more limiting in China. But to bridge the gap, of course, civil society will need to grow at a pace similar to that of Taiwan. So changing, again, course to view it from Washington's perspective. Washington, of course, has a very interesting position because both Beijing and Taiwan, many people believe Washington is the key. And when Washington says it's none of our business. Washington actually was based, its position, its one China policy is based on the Shanghai Communique. For those of you who are experts, many of you I know here can name every single person at that table. I, for one, could not. But the Shanghai Communique, you can see, was based on the assumption that Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. And the new Taiwanese identity, of course, challenges this assumption. Apologize for that coverage. And what I want to say in the last line is the US also has three options. First option is to upgrade relations with Taiwan, support Taiwan, give more room to Taiwan in international organizations, especially where it can make a difference. Healthcare, like SARS, civil aviation. Taiwan has so many flights and fighting criminals. And therefore, upgrade America's economic, political, and military relations. We have lovely Trump and lovely Tsai. Or we could stay the course. Stay the course. This is the USS Warship Taylor that was refitted to be sold to Taiwan. So U.S. is the largest arms sales vendor to Taiwan and continues to do so despite Beijing's protest. And it can continue this policy of dual deterrence by maintaining what it is doing now, which is keeping relations with Taiwan on a non-state to state, but basically having all the functions like AIT, and deterring Beijing or Taipei from taking actions to change the status quo, and hoping, praying nobody will call and that there will be a peaceful resolution. Or, lastly, strike a deal with China. Taiwan can be used in a negotiation with China. And here you have a typical book by Lal Goldstein saying, meeting China halfway. Let's do a deal. We give Taiwan to China as a way to get something from China. Well, all of that is very interesting, especially in the last few days. But I want to talk about Hong Kong for the last 5 minutes, maybe 10. Taiwan, of course, exemplifies broader trends in the world. It is both unique and not. Where it is not unique is you can see here, after finally wrapping up the book and before Trump opened his mouth or picked up the phone, I had some time and I went to visit a few countries around the world that had identity polarization and inconsistent economic policy. Here I'm in Budapest with somebody that I didn't know, but I wanted to replace my broken bag. And so I went to the Central Market, and there's the Taiwan flag on top of this stall with all these flags of countries I didn't know. So I thought there were countries. And teaching international relations, both Harry and I were completely shamed and decided to wait for the owner to find out what's going on. He comes back with a jacket. On his jacket is the flag of Catalonia. And he goes to his box and brings out a huge Taiwanese flag for me to hold and says, look at my flag. I said, what is that? That is a flag of the hometown of Dracula, Transylvania. So I said, oh, nice. He says, no, this is very important. Taiwan is a symbol of our struggle. All of these are nations in Europe that are seeking for more autonomy. And just like us, Transylvanians, they want to raise their children with proper identity. And I want my children to have a Transylvanian identity, so I moved to Budapest, so we don't have to study under the Romanian government. Transylvania is a 2 million population nation that has secure borders, yet has been governed by different regimes over the decades. So there is a rise in local identity all around Europe and around the world, which Taiwan is basically a part of, with different values. Other examples are more familiar to you. Occupy Wall Street is one where they're fighting inequality. Taiwan has become more and more unequal. With the 0.345 Gini coefficient, it is still much more equitable than most societies like China. However, the relative change toward less equality is rattling the middle class, or the disappearance of the middle class. And this is what, of course, Occupy Central was about. And you can see this protest is primarily by young people. Taiwan used to have, the top 20% used to have 4 times the income of the bottom 20% of the household. Today, that number is 6.2%. This is a Labor Day protest in 2015 in Puerta del Sol and Madrid, where I lived years ago. But here you can see youth unemployment as the date of this picture was 47% versus the average is less than half of that. Taiwan is similar at 12% youth unemployment rate, double that of the national average. Young people are feeling despair. Farage is here saying, let's get out of the EU. Look at all the immigrants. The anti-immigration sentiment in Brexit is something that's very telling of the failure of the European project. After years of economic integration, it has not led to more political integration. And the recent results in Italy, of course, speak further to this. And the whole list of ultra-right-wing, as well as the cooperation with some ultra-right left-wing groups in Europe, shows how desperate the situation may be. Finally, I've been talking about the rise of Trump for a few weeks before the election, and I was often booed. I had no idea that I actually was onto something much bigger. I just thought there was a lot of support for Trump. I didn't think there was majority electoral support. But I think Trump really shows you a changing sense of identity in America. Most people who vote for Trump only know people who vote for Trump. Most people who vote for the other side only know people who vote for the other side. And this is what is, of course, very depressing. And last but not least, President Park in Korea is going through a huge challenge, no longer the president. I shouldn't call her that. About to be former president, is facing a lot of challenge. And I would say this is extremely similar to Taiwan in that it's a protest against the elites, against crony capitalism, against business government collusion, which is something that very much parallels Taiwan. Coming to home. Hong Kong has a similar dilemma as Taiwan. So in the last part, I'm just going to talk about Hong Kong and Taiwan together, what my book and my research and the data means for the future of Hong Kong. So I think the Sunflower Movement, of course, is similar to the umbrella movement in that they're fighting for fundamental values that need to be reconsidered. Hong Kong is very similar to Taiwan in that it has all the measurements, all the polls available to us to study. However, Hong Kong's changing sense of identity really happened only in the last few years. So Taiwan, over 30 years, is condensed into 3 years in Hong Kong, dramatically. Because until the Olympic in 2008, there was a rising sense of identity or fluctuating sense of support for a Chinese identity. And of course, in Hong Kong, there are very few people who are divided by the 1949 line. In fact, many people have parents who were born in China or are themselves 1 million people here were born in China. So you can see here that basically there's a rising sense of Hong Kong identity. As of August now, it is 67% of Hong Kong people say they're a Hong Konger, and younger people is much higher. Hong Kong identity, the second measurement, which is parallel to Taiwanese supporting autonomy, there's 2 ways to measure. I just show one. Confidence in one country, two system, or trust in the central government. Both of that is declining to an all-time low. This is even more so among the younger generation. And of course, younger generation now increasingly supports independence, which is not something that had been polled in the past. The backlash against globalization in Taiwan and Hong Kong is a result of high level of dissatisfaction with the elites, the established, the educated, people with cars and houses like you and me with graduate degrees, especially among those under 29. This high income trap, which actually includes Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the United States, many countries in Europe, sees rising inequality, aging population. Taiwan actually had the lowest fertility in the world in 2011, and Hong Kong was not far behind. Nobody's having children or having them late. Job loss, stagnant wages, higher housing costs all contribute to this sense of a trap. Economic problems, of course, may be addressed if there's effective public policy, which is already extremely challenging. But the problems are beyond economics, beyond material. These trends produce extreme preferences, especially when the sense of identity is threatened, as we see in all the examples I gave. Young people blame China, however, in Hong Kong and Taiwan rather than globalization, like young people in other parts of the world. And I would just note here, in the case of Brexit, actually more than 70% of young people wanted to remain. So there's a slight difference in terms of how young people view economic liberalization as beneficial or not. In Hong Kong and Taiwan, SIPA and the ECFA are perceived to present unevenly distributed opportunities that benefit maybe just a few, and challenges their sense of identity and values. Young people participate more and more actively in politics, but they do not embrace existing parties, left or right. Whether they may not be anti-China, they may not talk about China much at all, but they're simply skeptical about more political integration with China. And they also see fundamental differences with China that are harder to bridge, such as democracy, freedom of speech, and social justice. Thank you very much. As I mentioned, I've just been slaving away this week every day, trying to catch up with the op-eds. So I just did an op-ed in South China Morning Post a few days after Trump talked. And then just 3 hours ago, my interview was posted on New York Times, which you can see, which addresses the Trump call in further detail. Thank you, Alice.
Thank Thank you, Shirley. Thank you for that really comprehensive presentation. I know we're kind of running a little bit late, so we only have a few minutes to take questions. So, Andrew, and then maybe question from the students. Be prepared. Okay, short questions, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Shirley, for the most fascinating presentation. You rightly pointed out that it's not just the economy stupid. So it raises the question how countries which are confronted with this kind of contradictions, rising identity, a wave of identity of regions. It's in the case of China and perhaps in Hong Kong. What kind of lessons, what kind of advice you would offer to the countries in that position to keeping their sense of national sovereignty, but while addressing this rising tide of a wave of self-identity, which translates into anti-globalization, anti-immigration, to a certain extent inequalities. But as you rightly pointed out, it's not just the economy stupid. Thank you very much.
Well, Andrew, thank you for that very insightful question. In fact, I would say that you are totally right. I will answer your question with your own question, which actually is, it's all about the economy. So my point is that it's much greater, much broader than the economy, but without fixing the economy, without fixing inequality and addressing job loss and stagnant wages, you will not get anywhere with identity. So in essence, it's my framework that identity is the foundation for the way we think. However, after we are sure of who we are, of course, what's most important is we can rationally choose what is in our interest. So those are two inseparable part of how policy is made. And therefore, I was very concerned after I attended President Tsai Ing-wen's inauguration, because in her inauguration, she talked a lot about values and, of course, identity. However, I was concerned that the economy would not be actually restructured and reformed. And so I wrote an op-ed too in the Wall Street Journal right after I attended the inauguration to say it's all about the economy. and I think this is because China does bring China and mainlandization, especially in the Hong Kong case, there's more immigration, whereas Taiwan has very limited. Taiwan has less than 200,000 mainland Chinese, primarily spousal reunions. And it's really limiting in terms of who can stay and work in Taiwan. But I think that without a community understanding its own interest and being able to address economic problems, it will not be able to change people's sense of identity. So I think, first of all, for Taiwan's case, it's very conflicting. Taiwanese believe very strongly in economic freedom. So if you ask people, especially young people, yes, of course our island must be open. We depend on trade and investment. This is what a small community does. This is what we do. We're traders. So if you tell them to close off borders, it's unbelievable. That's totally contrary to their instincts. However, with China, it's different because China, of course, is trading with the enemy and trading with the enemy that is threatening to subsume you. So I think the difference in both the case of Taiwan and Hong Kong is while economic liberalization is supported even more so in Hong Kong than in Taiwan, that there is a limit to how that is done in relations to China. But I would say this is common with the rest of the world. Like in Europe, one could say Russia is a threat, but most countries like Italy are concerned about the European integration, not because it threatens their sense of freedom or democracy, but there is a big issue there, which is immigration. And immigrants, some believe, threaten their sense of value because they don't assimilate. And I believe all of these things start with proper policy. And this is a big problem in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. There is no public policy or proper institute with long-term planning that can inject vitality in government's way of thinking, and innovation is key. There needs to be innovation in public policy, otherwise inequality is impossible to solve. You can see all around the world. And this will be a source for increasing protectionism like 100 years ago.
Shirley, I wanted to ask you, you talked a lot about Hong Kong and Taiwan youth, you know, the unemployment rate and so on. How about my sense from reading some of the kind of the polls, the optimism is a lot of it is coming from the youth of China. If you have done polls, and opportunities in terms of economic opportunity used to be, I think, a lot of the young people felt that they can go and study, and I think China does have a very open policy about studying there, but working. But many of them, my understanding, the ones in Taiwan, they chose not to. I mean, there is this differentiation. They're happy being baristas. Many of them, I mean, there are studies of a lot of them are very much educated. There's a lot of university. I think I just learned from Susie, there's about 100 and whatever universities in Taiwan. They're happy to stay in that kind of one of the things I find is disturbing is kind of this inward looking. They're happy with their cocoon, and rather than going China or going west. But can you talk about comparing the youth of these three areas, since you have students, I'm sure, from all three, and also you kind of know China from your work previously?
Well, this is intimidating because there's at least half the people here are very young, so they'll probably correct me. But let me use research. This is a great crutch for academics. I tell you what I read and data I know. So I was at a conference with primarily a Japanese delegate right after Trump was elected, and we were talking about what's wrong with young people. So this is really interesting. It's always what's wrong with young people. I said, oh, what about what's right with young people? What is young people? So we started a discussion, and I've been reading up on Japanese literature, and I think this is very common in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and in Japan, where, similar aging population, fewer young people, lots of old people staring at you, wanting you to succeed, hoping you'll just succeed. But the likelihood, and just 2 days ago, I think it's the New York Times, it shows that fewer and fewer Americans believe they will do better than their parents. And this is already the case in most European countries. 75% of French young people do not believe they will make more money than their parents in their lifetime in real terms. So what about here? So in Japan, about, I think, 2009, there was a comic book strip writer who who drew something that became a nationwide phenomenon and now a pan-Asian phenomenon called vegetarian men. Well, I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Vegetarian men are men who live at home, boys who live at home. They graduate, they don't go out, they eat vegetables, and they're not very aggressive. They don't take the first move to hook up with somebody because it's too much effort. And so there's the derivative literature, and hundreds of Japanese books came after that, which is translated into primarily mainland Chinese books about carnivorous women. And this is, basically that a society where there's very few incentives to actually accumulate, this is my interpretation now, to accumulate asset because of the low interest rate, which may change in a few hours. But given the low interest rate environment for the last 7 years, basically assets have gone to an unbelievable level. Nobody in Tel Aviv, New York, London can afford housing. And so if you can't afford housing, why not just live at home? And the Japanese Omai, the famous Mackenzie writer, author, wrote another book recently that is about the 7-Eleven culture, which corresponds to this. If you could just wake up and get onigiri, like a rice ball, at 7-Eleven for $5, and you could get it at 10 a.m. Then you can go at 4 p.m. to get another rice ball. You spend $10 a day. That's all your cost, and you're a web designer, and you don't need to make too much. So basically, everyone sort of stopped moving towards accumulating asset, which is a prime sort of mindset for most of our generation. And so if you don't have that mindset that you need to buy a house, marry a girl, marry a boy, have kids, and provide them to go to private school, then you don't have any of the incentives that we have. So why move to China? Why do all of these things? Have dirty food or dirty air and crazy traffic just so that you can not buy an apartment in Shanghai? So I think again, I'm going back to, as a political economist, I'm very focused on the economic incentives, which are declining, but at the same time, value differences, of course. If you don't have the economic incentives and your values are different than those around you, I think that young people are very different than us. They grew up going to China all the time. And so they understand China, they go there, and they choose to go or not.
Okay. Right there. I think it has to be the last question. I hope you don't mind because we're running kind of late.
Oh, can we?
William from Hanlong Properties. Just a very quick question. I'm interested in your predictions on U.S.-China relations. If Donald Trump really challenged the one-China policy, because Beijing is also very powerful and they're principled. Yeah,
No,
you.
Beijing is very powerful. Beijing is the most important actor in this trilemma that I talked about. Trump is a very interesting character. I have to thank him for putting Taiwan on the map. So I just finished teaching a course on my book at University of Virginia, and all of my students wrote me in the past week saying, unbelievable, I am now the expert in the hallway. I'm the expert in Richmond, Virginia. Everyone wants to know what's up. Where is this country? What is the one China policy? What is the 92 consensus? I think Trump is a very unpredictable person, but in that light, it's a very good wake-up call, as I wrote in my op-ed, to the U.S. to wake up. Because from 1972 to now, after Nixon visited, U.S. has really not changed its policy, which is fine. But the problem is China has changed, and Taiwan has changed even more. So while everybody is changing, U.S. is hoping, any U.S. president hopes to wake up and not receive a call. And that is not going to happen. It will receive a call or see something on TV. That is too late. And I think that therefore the U.S. has not reviewed its China policy, its one China policy, since the Clinton administration. Even after the Clinton administration reviewed the policy, it decided to move only slightly in terms of protocols. So Trump could be doing the same. A call could just be a protocol changing activity that is nothing more than that. But it could be something else. As I point out, there's three options, three ways to think about actually the same call. It could be a bargaining chip with China. It could be just, it could be actually upgrading relations with Taiwan because it supports Taiwan as a democracy. That's totally different than viewing Taiwan as a bargaining chip. Or it's nothing. It's staying the course, but Trump is messing things up a bit, mixing things up.
Thank you, Shirley.
Can I just ask Alice,
Sure.
Can we ask one woman?
Oh, yes.
I always want to...
Ladies, please, at least one. Eugenie. Well, students, come on, lady.
I see a lot of women students, no? If not, Eugenie.
All right, Eugenie. Keep it short,
Our
please.
expert.
I mean, it's kind of interesting. I think, in the financial world, Taiwan has, because of its paranoia about China and the coercion or whatever coercive effect of China, that Taiwan's kind of receded, being one of the 5 Asian tigers, a decade ago. Today, Taiwan's not even mentioned in the scheme of, the economics development in Asia. And certainly, when it comes to Asian regional conferences, financial type conferences, I've actually made an attempt to invite Taiwan to attend so that they're represented in these Asian-wide discussions, and they've always declined. So really, is it this paranoia that is actually causing Taiwan to recede? You mentioned globalization, that people want to be interested in globalization. It sounds to me that they're so paranoid that they're not even interested in globalization or even regionalization.
I think your question is twofold, Eugenie, because of course, I don't expect anything less than that from you, the most challenging question. There's 2 parts to answering your question. One is because you're in asset management and in finance, so it's a little bit different. I have a very particular and a very strong view about finance in Taiwan. I sit on financial institution boards, and I also mentioned in my Wall Street Journal op-ed that Taiwan's finance is a big problem. Under continental law, it basically, it's hoping internationalization is going to happen, but it won't. It is highly regulated and under-enforced, selective enforcement. Recently, one of the banks that actually Ma Ying-jeou's wife used to work at was fined by the New York State. And it was just a accident waiting to happen because compliance is very weak and unprofessional. And I think that a lot of it has to do with a government regulation and its capacity. So finance is something that is very restrictive, and unless Taiwan can break through this, it's never going to be a financial center. that competes with Hong Kong. And Hong Kong has that, of course, great advantage. So that's the first part. Second part, though, so finance is a little bit more special. But the second part is it is a cycle. As it is more and more marginalized from the world, and it becomes less and less economic competitive, it becomes less and less interested in going out to the world. And therefore, for example, I was in Seattle, and there were 3,000 mainland Chinese students at the University of Washington undergrad, 1,000 Taiwanese. This number was somewhat reversed, if you will, a few years ago. So why is that? Well, I think just like Japan, Hong Kong is different, Singapore is different, but Taiwan is very similar to Japan in that the number of people going to study undergraduate abroad is declining to all-time low because people don't see the reason they will go and spend all this money on a graduate, going to school in England or in Seattle and to come back to no job. Even if you go to University of Seattle or you go to Oxford, you go back to Taiwan, you're still getting 22,000 NT a month. So why are you doing that? So the Japanese have long shown that they won't do it. So, for example, my undergraduate, Harvard College, has been receiving almost no Japanese undergraduate application. And when I went to school, we had the current princes of Japan there, and I had two actually classmates in my class who went to actually Harvard and University of Tokyo at the same time. It was so dynamic. So I think Taiwan is falling into that trap. Unfortunately, the economics make them more inward-looking, and the more inward-looking makes them less competitive economically. But I would just say one thing. It does not mean this is something they do it unconsciously or they are interested in marginalizing themselves. There's something else that with what Alice has just asked, because of the lack of incentives, one thing that's very good is young people are reevaluating what they really care about. And this is something Hong Kong shares. So these open polls ask people what is the most 5 important values that they see as part of their identity. And Hong Kong young people and Taiwanese young people keep on listing things that older generations don't list. And in Hong Kong, the most glaring difference, of course, is older generation usually put rule of law as the first value that they care deeply about. And Hong Kong young people today say democracy. In Taiwan, young people write things like they want a just society, they want a clean environment, and older people simply don't think that's number one. Number one is growth, or, a better economy. So anyway, in answer to your question, there are many facets. There's the economics part, but there's also a real difference in value.
Shirley, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here tonight. I have a feeling maybe instead of getting a phone call from the president, you're going to get a tweet from him one of these days, because you've been, a lot of what you've talked about, I think he also has been talking about. So we wait for that tweet, and when that happens, please come back and tell us all about it. But thank you so much. A little small token of our appreciation for your wonderful presentation.